Welcome to another episode of Before You Kill Yourself with your host, Leo Flowers. Today's episode is brought to you by Forever Me Apparel. Forever Me Apparel is all about affordable clothing that not only looks good, but feels just as good. They strive to keep the people around the world fresh and in with the newest and some retro styles. They can and will ship anywhere in the world. Mental health is a big portion of what they do. They have donated over 250 pieces of clothing to people struggling, and they don't have any intentions of stopping now. They want to supply everything from head to toe. It's always been and always will be about the people, because without the people, we are just forever nothing. Head on over to Forever Me Apparel to grab a beanie, t-shirt, or bag. Once again, Forever Me Apparel. Today's guest is someone who I've been wanting to have on forever, since day one. He's written a million books. We have Dr. Thomas Joyner, who is an American academic psychologist and leading expert on suicide. He is the Robert O. Lawton Professor of Psychology at Florida State University. I'm a big Florida Gator fan, but you know what? We're not even going to split hairs on that. And he operates his laboratory for the study of psychology and neurobiology of mood disorders, suicide, and related conditions. He is the author of Why People Die by Suicide, which I've read and have marked up and highlighted and taken notes and referred back to, even though it was written in 2005. And what's cool in his episode, he talks about things he would add and change from that book since he's written it. He's also written The Myths of, I can never say myths about suicide in 2010, and the current editor-in-chief of Suicide and the Life-Threatening Behavior. Now, he's also written his more current book is about mindfulness, which is what we get into, which is what we start off with in this episode. We talk about mindfulness and how it's being portrayed and what it actually means. And I think that's really important for a lot of us in terms of who are struggling with anxiety. But of course, although we start off talking about anxiety, we very quickly get into mindfulness and stoicism. And these two topics are something that are very powerful for people who are struggling with anxiety at this moment and in these times of uncertainty, which people say that in these times of uncertainty, times have always been uncertain. Like there's never been a point in a time of life history where people are like, this is exactly what's going to happen at Tuesday, 3:43 p.m. Like we plan, we schedule, we set goals, but at the end of the day, we have no idea what's going to happen from one moment to the next, but we just do our best. So we talk about mindfulness to start off the episode, and then we talk about the fact that we don't have a good handle on what genes affect suicidality. I was really surprised by that. And so, yeah, we definitely get into the genetic component of suicidality and also address the idea of, does suicidality run in families? I said run in family, but run in families. And then we get into who was vulnerable to burnout. And this is an important question because a lot of people who work in the mental health industry, psychologists, people who work at the suicide prevention hotlines, encounter burnout. And even if you aren't in the mental health industry, this perspective on what causes burnout is so impactful and so valuable that you definitely want to hear this, because this relates to if you're burnt out in your relationship, if you're burnt out at work. What we talk about in terms of burnouts and burning out is so valuable. So check that out. And as I said, he wrote the book Why People Die by Suicide, and we get into changes caused by that. And then what's buffering people from suicidality during this quarantine? Buffering as in what's protecting people, saving people's lives during this time. And then also how to recruit allies for your treatment, for your mental health, or for the mental health of the people in your family, your friends who might be struggling with mental health. You don't have to, pursue this alone. You can recruit allies, and there are people who are around you who you may not have considered that can help you. And then, really, what I really love during this episode is he talks about being mission prepared. And this is in response to self-care. A lot of people are talking about self-care this, self-care that, and it kind of has a selfish component to it. And so we reframe it in terms of calling it mission preparedness. And so we go a lot deeper into what does that mean for you and for the people around you. So there's so much in this episode. It's power packed. It didn't disappoint. I'm so grateful that Dr. Thomas Joyner took this time out to join us. And once again, please go to thrivewithleo.com for one-on-one coaching with yours truly. We're all going through something, and there's no need for us to go through it alone. So let's get to tomorrow together. With that said, let's jump into the episode. All right. I'm excited. I'd love to start off, Thomas Joyner. First of all, thank you for joining me. I've read your book, Why People Die by Suicide, but I'd love for us to start off with one of your newer books, the one on mindfulness and narcissism. And if you could talk to us, because the word mindfulness is such a trendy word, and people are just hopping on board and using it in different ways. What's your take on this idea of mindfulness and how it's being used?
I mean, I think one of the main motivations for that book was the trendy, everybody jump on board type of thing that's going on, or that was going on and still's going on. And I thought that needed a response, I felt, because there's something very valuable in the original, what I view as authentic, genuine version of mindfulness. But I think what's happened to it is that that's gotten altered and changed and watered down. And really the book is a complaint. It's a complaint about that watering down and the loss of the original, sort of feeling of it. So my understanding of the original is that it's very selfless. And the versions that I've become concerned about and that I wrote about in that book seem to me very selfish. And I think that's a problem. And so the book is really kind of a complaint about that problem.
So, when I think about selfless, I think about sacrifice, doing things for other people, and selfish. It's like you're doing it for the sake of your own good, and it doesn't contribute to society or benefit those around you or the community in any way. How is it that mindfulness is being touted as a selfish thing to do in our society?
Well, my understanding of it is, one of the original, basic ideas is that it's important to attend to the moment-to-moment experience in an open, non-judgmental kind of way. And I think there's a beauty to that idea, and a utility to that idea too. My concern, though, is that my understanding of the original was that the attention that one was supposed to pay was to everything. This color of the sky and of the trees and of the people around you, what they're feeling, what they're saying, what they're thinking, et cetera, never mind the rest of the infinite universe and cosmos, everything. There's so much outside of oneself to pay attention to. And yet the current mindfulness trend seems to always return to paying attention to oneself. And that's really the piece that just kind of got stuck in my craw. I really don't specialize in mindfulness. I'm a psychologist. I know some things about it, but it's not my research specialty or anything like that. I really just wrote the book just I just had to get that kind of off of my chest.
I really appreciate you saying that because I have friends who are trying to practice gratitude. And the way gratitude is being used, at least by most people, is I hear them saying they're running out of things to be grateful for. And what I realize, what they're really saying is that they've run out of things to be grateful for themselves. And they haven't taken the time to say, you know what? I'm grateful that my neighbors are having a dinner at home together. Never mind you being a part of that. It's just the fact that somewhere in the world there are families sitting down, having a nourishing meal, having a great conversation, checking in on each other. Grateful that an ambulance can get from the hospital to wherever the emergency is in time to save someone and bring them back. It's like being thankful that the moon or the sun revolves around, or the earth revolves around the sun. Like all these things that are outside of us that have nothing to do with us, but that affect us in some way. And when we start to think about when we start to zoom out more, think about the big picture and just being thankful that there is a Congress or advocates or lobbyists, we start to realize how much more connected to other people in the universe we are.
I couldn't agree more. That's really a big part of the book, is trying to redirect people's attention, whether it's through mindfulness or what I view as kind of neighboring practices like gratitude practice. In all of those cases, I think there's really something potentially beautiful and something potentially useful there, as long as it's not used as a vehicle for selfishness. And I think that's the problem, is that it so regularly becomes that, when, just as you point out, there's an infinite number of things to think about outside of the self on Earth. Never mind in our solar system, never mind beyond that in the infinitude of the cosmos. It's really remarkable to prioritize one's tiny, trivial, temporary self over all that. But people do that, and that's what the book is complaining about.
How do you practice mindfulness?
I don't particularly, to be honest. I guess to the degree that I do, it would be along the lines of what the I'm blanking on the term, but the philosophers I talk about in the book, the Stoic philosophers, forgive me, I just been kind of a long day. The Stoic philosophers said, and it really has nothing to do with being Stoic, like unemotional, like you don't like joyless. That's not what Stoicism meant to the ancient Greeks. Rather, it means, take things as they come, moment by moment, focus on what you actually have control over, and not the things that you don't. And then recognize that every moment's got a lot of value to it because it's so fleeting, and it'll never come again. And then the next one, same and same. And that's just how you keep going. That's very similar to what authentic mindfulness, I think, said and stated. And it's interesting, if you read those Stoic philosophers, how there's nothing about not very much about the self at all. They're not at all worried about those kinds of preoccupations, whereas the modern mind, it seems to me, is pretty obsessed with that.
Yeah, I read a lot of Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, and you're right. It was all about the bigger picture and how does one conduct oneself, but in relation to other people. Everything was in relationship to your family, friends, and community. As you mentioned earlier, mindfulness isn't your main area of focus or expertise. Suicidality is, and I understand that you had a member of your family in their life, which is what spurred you. Can you tell us just briefly about that, and then what you're focusing on now today, especially with the coronavirus, et cetera?
Sure. The motivation for the whole career trajectory going on now 30 years or more, actually, it really, there's a lot to talk about it, but I boil it down to two things. And one is a fascination with the idea of, first of all, of having a self at all. That's actually a pretty fascinating philosophical thing of what is a self? What does it mean to possess a self? What are the rights and the obligations and responsibilities and the duties of that self in relation to other people? And then to imagine that there are some people who decide to take that self and kill it. I couldn't understand it. And yet it happened frequently enough that it seemed like it really cried out for an answer. And then my own dad died by suicide and brought it home very, very painfully. It taught me a lot about grief and pain and shock and agony. It also taught me a lot about suicide itself. And so those are the two motivations for an entire career dedicated to trying to understand why this happens. And I'm not trying to understand it just because it would be intellectually fascinating. I do think it is intellectually fascinating, but that's not the point at all. The point is to prevent people from having to go through what my dad went through and then what my family went through in the aftermath. I wish that on no one. And I've been trying to put a stop to it as best I can ever since.
I appreciate that. And your book, Why People Die by Suicide, was such a fascinating read. And it's also a reminder of how someone can take their pain and turn it into purpose, and use that to help save other people's lives so they don't have to go through what you or any other trauma someone else might be going through. In that book, it seems like when we talk about suicidality, it feels like it boils down to just a few things, where we're talking about either feeling like a burden, like people would be better off without me, or they feel lonely and disconnected. But the overarching is that hopelessness of, not that things, here's what I just found out, is like, it's not so much that things will get worse, it's just that things won't get better. When you look back at your father or the research you're doing currently, has that changed at all? Because I know the book was written in, I think, 2009. And so has that changed at all, or is there any other additions to that idea?
It really has stood the test of time pretty well. There have been some tweaks based on the subsequent research that I have done and that other groups around the world have done on the theory. But really, it's remained pretty much similar. I guess the main change would be back then. The actual first appearance of the book was in 2005. So I was working on this, I don't know, 2003, 2000, almost 20 years ago. And back then, I really thought that the capacity to die by suicide, that's one of the main contributions of that theory in that book, by the way, is the emphasis on, it's really hard to do this. Suicide's really difficult to actually do. It's super scary and painful potentially. We have all these ancient mechanisms built into us to prevent us from dying, much less killing ourselves. And so that's one of the first questions to grapple with, is that how in the world do people do that? How do they overcome that really ancient basic instinct to preserve life? And so back then I thought that part of the theory, I thought people learned that mostly. In other words, they acquired that capacity through experience mostly. And now I still think that, but I think that the role of genetics is pretty important in that capacity. But back then, I might have said, it's probably about 40% genetics and 60% experience. And now, almost 20 years later, I would just flip that around and say, both are still important, but I'd say it's more like, 55, 60% genetics and the rest experience. But other than that, the ideas have remained pretty stable.
When you talk about building it up, your book has helped me take my mental health more seriously in that I recognize I was engaging in some behaviors that to others may have seemed trivial. But in a book, you talked about how because it does take so much to build up to ending your life, that people actually they work up to it. They take these steps where maybe they're being a bit more reckless every time, and taking more chances and or harming themselves more, or if they've been abused, they work up a pain tolerance over time. And I recognize I was doing that in some areas of my life, and I was like, oh, I gotta nip this in the bud because I don't want to build up this tolerance. So I thank you for that. For that was part of the research on suicidality I'd never really read about. But when you talk about the genetic component, what genetically are we talking about? I know in a book you talk about serotonin and some other drugs. Can you talk more about the genetic component?
Yeah, well, back then, it really did seem that the serotonin system and the genes that kind of build it, so to speak, it really seemed like those were promising targets back then. And that's another thing that I would probably revise if I rewrote the book, here in 2020. It's not that serotonin system, parameters aren't implicated. It's just they're only a very, very, very small piece of the incredibly complicated story. So with regard to genetics more generally, we actually don't have a good handle on which particular genes or assemblage of genes and what it is they're building or coding for exactly in nervous systems. There's just an enormous way to go on that research frontier. But what we do know is that the something like the capacity for suicide, or for that matter, suicide itself, those things run in families for sure. And we also know that the reason that they run in families is not having to do with the shared environment of the family, but rather the genes that are running in the family. Now, I talk about these sorts of things a lot to general audiences. I'm pretty familiar with some concerns that pop up, especially in people who say maybe lost their spouse to suicide, and then they wonder, well, what's the risk for my children? And it's a very natural question, of course. And when I talk about 60% genes, that can make it sound kind of scary to people in that situation. My answer is to reassure them that, well, there is some increase in risk. Yes, that's true, but it's really pretty minimal. It takes the number from the way this is done is per 100,000. That's how the epidemiologists do this, is per 100,000. And in the U.S., the national rate is somewhere in the ballpark of 15 per 100,000. That's just for anybody. Let's say it's 15 per 100,000 for anybody. If you have a first degree biological relative, like a father or mother or sister or brother, who's died by suicide, that number goes from 15 to maybe 16 or 17 per 100,000. Yeah, it's just an increase, but it's not a whopping increase by any means. So it's important. I guess my point here is it's important to keep genetics in perspective.
That completely makes sense. I appreciate you sharing that, because we know that there is an effect of how the environment can activate certain genes. It's almost like having a cancer gene. We're all walking around with it, but it's about our interaction with the environment that determines how those cancer genes become expressed in our body. And it sounds like it's similar to what you're talking about. If you take a kid whose spouse whose parent or grandparents have ended their lives, then the chances of them committing suicide are very small. However, if there's trauma or sexual abuse, and then they also maybe go off to war, so now there's PTSD and then there's drug, now we're starting to increase the likelihood. So it's a compound of factors. Is that what you're alluding to?
In part, I mean, it's definitely an incredibly complicated mix. So complicated that there's a lot of current interest in work that utilizes machine learning, sort of computer algorithms to try to do prediction. Because anything less than that, and that can incorporate thousands and thousands of variables, and then all the different permutations between all those variables. It's way too complex for any human mind. That's how complex the prediction of individual suicide seems to be. Nevertheless, I think there are commonalities, and that's what that book is about. Is yes, it's incredibly complex, but there still might be some commonalities within all that complexity. And my answer for what those commonalities are in that book. It's things like you feel like a burden, you feel lonely from others, and you feel like you're able to do this really, really difficult thing.
Now, with that loneliness to others, I think that a lot of people also think, like there's a misperception of what mindfulness really is. But I think there's also a misperception of what loneliness is, and that there's this idea that the more friends that we have, the more physical friends, or the more social media friends that we have, it's about quantity. And if I have 1,000 friends or a million likes and followers, then I'm not going to be lonely. If I live in New York City where there's a bunch of people, then I shouldn't be lonely. Is that what we're talking about, or is it something deeper than that?
You're definitely on to something really important in terms of the quality of social connection versus the mere quantity. Quality is really the key. And the other thing that's interesting here, and I've heard this from many, many times from people who have lost loved ones to suicide. They'll hear me talk about these kinds of ideas about loneliness and feeling socially disconnected. And initially they're puzzled because they'll say things like, but he wasn't lonely. In fact, on the day of his suicide, I told him I was there for him and that I love him. And so did my sister and so did my cousin, et cetera. And that can all be quite true. And at the same time, the person can nevertheless still feel on the inside very lonely. And that's the key, is what people feel on the inside. And that's really one of the many very, very pernicious things about some of the mental disorders that are connected here, is that they can skew your mind so that though you really are cared for and loved and connected, you don't feel it because the depression or whatever is preventing that love and that care from getting through. And so it doesn't feel like that on the inside. And so that's to your point, is that, what really matters is that felt quality on the inside of whether or not you're connected and whether or not you matter.
Well, and this is so important, especially now. I'm 44 years old, and I was reading that, the suicide rates for men, especially white men. I mean, I don't fall into the white guy category, but I'm in that age group where suicide rates tend to go up, and it's because part of what they're saying is that as men get older, we don't make more social connections. We who our friends were from our childhood or from the military. That's it. That's when we stop making friends. And then as we get older, they just slowly start dying off. So we're just slowly watching our friend pool dissipate. And then the other part is that a lot of guys get married who have been married for years, 10, 20 years. They divorce in about their 20s or in their 40s. And their ties to a social connection was through their wife. Their wife's friends were their friends, and they didn't have any other. So then, when that divorce happens, now they're losing money, they're losing status, they're losing. It's too many transitions all at once, which is why I just started a men's group recently, and I've become more proactive. I was like, yeah, I fall in that category for sure, where I really wasn't trying to make more friends. I was like, I got enough. But how are you um, working with people or teaching people in terms of feeling more connected and less lonely? Because, like you said, it's mostly a mind state, right? It's not like I don't need to like join 12 groups. It's about mentally feeling connected. How do we help people feel more mentally connected to the people in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few pretty simple ideas about it, but despite their simplicity, I think people tend to forget about them or overlook them, especially men. I think there is a pretty pronounced gender difference about how men tend to take relationships for granted more than women do. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule, obviously, but generally speaking, that there is a pattern there. This is one of the main points of one of my other books on loneliness. It's called Lonely at the Top. And in that book, I made exactly the point you're talking about, is that whereas women tend to cultivate their relationships and their friendships over the years and decades, and they grow their number of friends, men tend to have some pretty close friends from, say, high school, maybe, or college, perhaps, or that time of life, when you're 15 to 20, 25, maybe. And then they just kind of forget about the question of friendship, and they don't invest further in it. That's a big mistake, because fast forward, just as you said, fast forward like 20, 30 years, some of those friends may have faded away, and you just find yourself all of a sudden lonely, especially in the wake of something like a divorce. And so, one thing that I've sort of counseled over the years is that those friends from back in the day, those connections from back in the day, those are worth keeping hold of tight, nurturing, revitalizing, because sometimes you fall out of touch. Maybe you weren't even that close a friend with someone back then, but now your interests have sort of shifted and towards one another, and you might be really good friends now. It's possible. Reach out and see. But the other thing that I really recommend is just real small doses of connection can go a long way with family, with neighbors and neighborhoods, with communities, with religious organizations, with civic groups, whatever the case may be. A small bit of reaching out, when it's done repeatedly, tends to take root and tends to grow and spread. And so if people will just sort of grasp onto that philosophy and really live by it, the relationships tend to grow over the months and the years. And then those relationships can be real buffers against all sorts of problems, certainly mental health problems, but also physical health problems and just life problems. When life gets hard, it's very nice to have a network of people that you can reach out to for counsel and for help.
Yeah, as I've shared with my listeners, I live in LA, but I'm currently in San Diego because of the quarantine, and my girlfriend lives down here. So I was like, let's just post up together down here versus a back and forth. And definitely struggling with loneliness and disconnection. I mean, LA's right there, but it's a hotbed right now, so I'm not going back. Um, but so I have intentionally been sitting on we have a house down here, a condo, and just sitting on the stairs and while I eat breakfast and lunch. And when people walk by, I say hello. I just say hi. And just to let them know, hey, I'm the new guy in the neighborhood. I'm the friendly guy. And if you ever want to say hi, you can say hi. And it's a small thing. And, of course, the first couple weeks, maybe even a month, people would barely look at me and just, keep walking by. And then the second month, people started saying hi. And then now people making eye contact, they're waving, things like that. A new neighbor just moved in. He already gave me a book on Winston Churchill that I'm excited to read. But I'm also dreading because it's 1,000 pages. But it's the point I'm trying to make is that it does require effort. And I think in this world of where we things happen seemingly overnight, it also takes time of planting the seed, of just waving, saying hi, and then that builds up into how's your day, and then that builds up to here's a book, uh, a biography on Winston Churchill, et cetera, et cetera. And we just have to give it space to grow and nurture it, like plants or kids.
Exactly. That's a great example. I mean, that's a really great example of how that works. Because it's a small thing, like you said, but sustained over weeks and months. One thing leads to another, et cetera, and a small thing can start to lead to more connection. And I think the analogy to like gardens or plants, is a good one, because that's exactly the idea, is that you have to daily nurture and water, or whatever the case may be, fertilize the garden, the plants, or else, you risk them withering away. It's a very similar process here. And like with something like, scattering some water or some fertilizer, it's not that hard. You just have to do it for a few seconds, really. But if you don't, then a lot of problems can ensue. I think it's a really similar kind of thing. And it's a kind of hopeful thing too, because a lot of times these kinds of problems feel huge. They feel really complicated and really huge. And those feelings are valid, actually. But the hopeful thing is that the solution doesn't have to be so huge or so complicated. It can be simple, small doses like this. They really go a long way. But the trick is the discipline, the commitment to do them very regularly, daily, if not, close to daily, if not literally daily, else they won't work. Same with gardening or growing flowers or whatever.
Thomas, I'd imagine studying suicidality and hearing so many stories, and on I'm sure people are emailing stories, texting you stories, asking you questions, and unloading so much onto you. How do you nourish yourself? How do you empty out and recharge so that you can keep showing up and fighting this good fight? I've read somewhere that the people who work on these suicide prevention hotlines, like there's a high suicide rate for them. So I wonder how for you, someone who's written so many books and so heavy in the fight, how do you nourish yourself?
It's a really interesting area. My own view on like the burnout kinds of pitfalls for health professionals and mental health professionals, it depends. I would point to two factors that really make a huge difference in terms of who is vulnerable to burnout and who is not. And one is just like dispositional, temperamental kinds of things, your basic personality. And I might get back to that, but a really key one is, do you feel effective in your day-to-day work? Do you feel like you're providing people with solutions that actually either solve what they're going through or cure it, or at least take the edge off of it? And if you do feel that, well, then the work, can be very sustaining and rewarding and hopeful, even if the problems are huge and very heavy, like suicide is. If you feel like you're actually making a positive difference, I don't see how burnout really is a problem. It hasn't been for me, because I've really felt that way for my whole career. But then if you're not, maybe you don't have access to the training as a mental health professional, you didn't get trained well. I don't know what the problems may be, but if you don't know what to do and you feel helpless in the face of something as heavy as this, I can see how that would lead to burnout very quickly, no matter what your disposition or personality may be. The other thing I would say about it is that it is important to take care of yourself. I think that's really key. And though I'm not the biggest fan of movements like, self gratitude or self forgiveness or self care, I do certainly am a big fan of. It's really key to get enough nourishment and to get enough sleep and rest and to take a break and to hydrate yourself and those kinds of things. To me, that's not really like self forgiveness or even self care. It's more like mission preparedness. Like I got a mission. I'm trying to prevent people from going through this today, tomorrow. And if I don't sleep, and if I don't eat, I'm not going to be able to do that. So that when you put it like that, self care becomes to me just an obvious thing that anybody would want to do. But when you put it like a lot of mental health professionals do, they kind of make it feel self-indulgent or whatever. And there are a lot of personalities who just don't resonate to that. I'm one of them. And the last thing I'd say about that is this area. I get the question a lot about, the area is definitely heavy and tragic. There's a lot of agony and misery, and it doesn't get to you. And the true answer is it really doesn't. And the reason is just because I think I have some. I don't have a full solution, that's for sure. If I did, I would immediately publicize it. But I've got some answers that help, and I enjoy providing those to people who really need them, and that's very rewarding and very sustaining. So I actually don't feel very troubled by it at all. I would if I felt helpless, but I don't feel that way.
I love that. Earlier, you talked about if you were to revise the book, you would change what you said about serotonin. Are there any other revisions or additions you would put in a book if you were to write it now in 2020, especially in light of the COVID situation and people quarantining? Does it add any layers of complexity to it?
It's interesting to think about. I mean, as with regard to revising the book, it's not that I'm wed to my ideas. It's not it at all. It's just that these particular ideas happen to have stood up pretty well over time, except for like that genetic piece and how I might, de-emphasize serotonin system things. But I still would have emphasized, the brain. It's obviously key. It's just so complicated. But mostly the ideas have stood up. So I don't think the book would look very different. And as for the pandemic, it's really interesting to ponder. And I'm puzzled by it because I'm already in print as of March of this year and into April and May, worrying about the possibility that this pandemic will lead to an increase in suicide risk via things like loneliness because people are staying at home, and also things like a surge in gun sales, which has definitely happened in March and April. I think March was maybe April. I can't remember now. One of those 2 months, Americans bought the most guns they've ever bought in the history of record keeping. That's a dangerous combination. More guns and more loneliness. That doesn't sound good to me. However, and then a colleague and I actually looked at national data from census type data, so very representative of the U.S. population from like April 2020 as compared to the same kind of data from April 2019. And sure enough, things like depression and anxiety definitely surged, as you might expect. And yet, I'm seeing subgroups who seem to be doing all right. Like, for instance, here in Tallahassee, we run a psychotherapy clinic. And we had to transition that from, of course, face-to-face psychotherapy to telehealth psychotherapy. So that was one transition among the huge transition that was occurring because of the pandemic. And we thought, and plus our patients are vulnerable to begin with. Most of them come to see us for reasons related to suicide. So it's a really high risk group to begin with. And we were worried that all this would make their risk even worse. It makes sense that it might, but it didn't. In fact, their suicide risk has gone down, and we think it's because of there's a number of factors, but one is that their ongoing psychotherapy. They can count on us. We're there for them every week, and we think that's been a real buffer. I've seen another paper recently where small town America, at least in certain regions of the country, seem buffered regarding mental health problems, whereas some other areas of the country, not as much. So it's a complicated picture overall. I don't know how much I would have. Certainly, if I wrote the book in 2020, I'm sure I would have gone into that. But it's a complicated enough picture that I don't know. I don't have any simple things to say about it, unfortunately. It's too complicated. The last thing I'll say about it is that when bad things happen, people can surprise you. They can rally together, they can pull together, they can be more supportive than they were, they can be more tolerant and accepting than they were, not less. And so that might actually mitigate suicide risk and mental health problems. So there's some things that might drive it up. There's some things that might drive it down. I guess I would say.
Now, I appreciate you sharing that in terms of the buffers in the small towns, and that makes sense because in a small town, people know each other for the most part, for good and bad, and so my mom is from Belize, and if somebody was sick, the whole neighborhood, everybody knew who was sick, and everybody would bring by soup and check in on you, so you felt that social connectedness. So I could see that in a small town where, like in a big city like New York, nobody's going to hop on a train to come see you if they're in Long Island and you're in Manhattan or, Brooklyn, et cetera, et cetera. What was interesting, I read this article, it was saying that in some parts, especially like in Asia, they've seen a decrease in suicides in terms of students because for a couple reasons. One is that the commute, people aren't commuting the way they used to. So that stress of, 32 minutes to an hour back and forth, for most people, they're looking at like a 2-hour commute if you're counting walking out to your, the whole ordeal of commuting. And then two, for students, there's been a decrease. It's too early to quite tell, but because they're not there's not access to the physical bullying that was taking place in school, and then there's less pressure for grades. Now they're at home and they can get more help from parents and other people, so they feel more supported in that area. And I don't know, I haven't read anything about students here if there's been an increase or decrease, but my girlfriend, she's starting to work for a suicide prevention hotline. And she said that most of the phone calls are from kids between the ages of 10 and 16. And it's about grades and breakups. Are you still at FSU? Are you still at Florida State?
Yes, that's right.
Are you seeing, I mean, before the quarantine, did you feel that students were feeling this pressure in terms of grades? And how does that play into feeling like a burden or loneliness in terms of so many kids have entered the life over grades? I understand the breakups, but the grades part.
Yes, that can be really anything that people use to assess their own, sense of value. And it can be a number of things, but for a young person, it can definitely be grades. And also the effects that grades have on, like the parents. The parents might be really concerned about a child's grades, even if the child's not so concerned. But the child may be concerned too. They may be embarrassed in front of their friends, so forth and so on. So it can be a factor for sure, but really anything that people use to judge themselves can end up being a factor. And I think some of those pressures have certainly, softened up a little bit under this pandemic. Um, and some other things I think changed too for the better. Not that this is good. I can't wait for it to go away, but there are some things. You mentioned the commute, and so instead of spending 2 hours, really a very unnatural thing to do if you think about it, spending 2 hours in a car with all those fumes around and everything. Instead of doing that, people are more relaxed at home, out of the fumes. Maybe they're getting a little more sleep, which is pretty key. Things like that. I can see how that would really be a good thing. Connections to family, can be enhanced if you're around them more. So can conflict, but on balance, probably connection sort of wins out. And then the last buffer type thing that occurs to me is under conditions of pandemic, people get, they value life, they value health, maybe more than they ever have. And so to me, the valuing of life itself and the valuing of health is really sort of an anti-suicidal mindset. And so I can see how all those things would come together to maybe push risk down. But still, I think we have to be open to both sides of this. People can get more lonely. People are buying more guns. People are buying a lot more alcohol too. Maybe, people who were in violent homes now are stuck in a violent home. That's a terrible, mixture. More alcohol, more guns, stuck in a violent home with more loneliness. That's scary. So both sides are possible. And I think we, at least in my own work, I'm trying to keep open to both sides and recognize that in some subgroups, there may be more risk, and then in other subgroups, there may be less risk.
In the book, you talked about how sometimes a suicide plan can backfire for people, especially if they've been discharged from an institution. Can you talk? Are there suicide prevention techniques or ideas out there that are being touted that at backfire you feel like are being misused or misunderstood?
There are some things that I think are really, useful. And I can talk about those a little bit in a second. But in terms of the things that backfire, not really. The only ones that kind of feel like that to me, one would be the lack of actually taking, doctors up or psychologists up on their offers of treatment. That's going to backfire for sure, especially if you really need it. So that occurs to me. There used to be kind of a thing in the field where people would engage in what was called safety contracting, where literally the therapist and the patient would sign a contract to the effect that the patient agrees not to kill themselves in the coming days or week or what have you. And that's no longer the state of the art, because though it probably maybe didn't actively backfire, it just didn't do any good. And the reason it didn't do any good was that, it didn't tell people what to do instead. It just says what not to do. Don't kill yourself, but it doesn't give people alternatives. Like, instead of doing that, here's a list of things you can do to keep yourself safe and in a good state of mind. And so that's now the state of the art. It's what's called safety planning. And you do all that kind of like brainstorming in advance of a crisis about, okay, how do you keep yourself safe? First of all, let's just get real practical about it. If there's a gun, well, how about not keeping that loaded? How about locking it up? Do you have a gun lock? Do you have a gun safe? How about storing it in the attic or, somewhere away from, like, right at hand? Or maybe your brother will take it, or your uncle or cousin or something, just temporarily, maybe let them take it, things like that. But also, if you get in advance of an emotional crisis, what tends to take the edge off of your crisis? Is it music? Is it friends? Is it going outside? Is it exercise? Is it YouTube? Whatever. Just have a plan in advance. Just doing those activities It won't be a cure. We're not, that's not the point. The point is, getting somebody at a dangerous crisis level, maybe even a lethal crisis level, a few notches down to where they can cope and survive and live on and fight another day, so to speak. So safety planning is really important. The key thing actually means safety, that idea of like taking the potential means of suicide, whether it's a gun or a rope or a container of medications or whatever it is, and just making that safer, even a little bit safer can make a big difference. And then the importance of interpersonal connection, including like hospitals, doctors, psychologists, social workers, all them reaching out as much as they can to vulnerable patients. It doesn't have to be like for an hour-long conversation. It can just be a small message along the lines of, we care about you, and if you need us, we're here. Here's how to call us. Things like that. It's that same theme of, small doses, depending on what the thing is, small doses can really have disproportionately large effects.
I love that. And as you were talking, I also was reminded of when I asked you about the grades, about I understand how also, because you mentioned how if someone didn't feel like the work they were doing was effective in terms of being a part of the suicide prevention hotline or in this line of work, that it could cause burnout. And I would assume for a student, if they felt like the efforts they were putting in to get an A or to graduate or to get into school, and so they felt like their effort was ineffective, that can lead to quote unquote burnout also. So I'm seeing the correlation there. It's about that feeling of is what I'm doing having an effect on the world around me, and whether that's physically, intellectually, socially, et cetera, et cetera. That feeling of effectiveness. I've always heard that make the means a little tougher. If you have a gun, hide the gun. Put the pills in a lockbox in the gun, and et cetera, et cetera. And Malcolm Gladwell, in his latest book, Talking to Strangers, he emphasized that. He tells a story about I think it was like was it Germany, some part of Europe, where all the houses used gas to heat them, and suicide rates were through the roof because people were literally just like shutting their doors and putting some towels up under there and then turning the gas on, and death by gas, suicide, committing suicide or completing suicide that way. And as soon as they removed all the gas from all the homes, suicide rates dropped by like 70%, because these people who want to end their lives, they didn't seek out another way to end their life. It's just that it was so convenient for them to turn the gas on, put some towels up under the door, and complete it. So this idea of, yes, lock the guns up, make the means inconvenient for you, hide it. In San Francisco, they put the nets under the bridge, and just putting that net and raising the guardrails up a few inches higher, that's deterred, reduced suicidality off the bridge. So these, like you said, it's about small dosage. It's about small dosage in terms of building connection with your community. It's about small dosage in terms of building a resistance, making it just a little bit harder for yourself to access the means to end your life. Or if you're living with somebody who is thinking about that, for you to keep them here just a little while longer until we can get them better. So every bit counts is what we're trying to say. Is there anything, Dr. Joyner, that we haven't discussed that you feel like the listeners should know as we wrap up here?
Well, I guess maybe, we touched on it, but the issue of treatment, of mental health treatment, and and how you go about accessing that. No, it is true that there are people who can struggle with access. That's true, and that's a problem in and of itself, a big problem. And then even for those who have access, there can be a problem of getting good quality mental health care. And that's another huge problem that we've got to do better at societally. Having said all that, there are treatments that do help. They're not total cures, but they help. And a lot of frontline people know about these treatments and can either provide them or point the way to them. And who I have in mind are primary care physicians. You know, they see a lot of everything. That's the nature of their job. Name it, they see it, including things like depression and anxiety and suicide risk and things like that. And they can either provide some help through medication on that themselves, or they can point the way to somebody more specialized. So that's one thing that people tend to take. They either take it for granted, or they don't really realize that, like a primary care physician can do that kind of thing, but they can. But not everybody goes to the doctor very frequently, and then so another kind of frontline idea that I think can be really helpful are clergy people. A lot of them, it depends on whether you're religious or not, and if you are, which kind of religion. But across religions, the clergy, they tend to be pretty aware of these kinds of problems, and people go to them with these kind of problems, and so they get pretty experienced at figuring out where to point people in terms of resources and help and treatment. So I guess I would say those two groups, keep those in mind as allies to help you cope with some of these pretty common problems that many, many people and many, many families grapple with.
I never thought about that. That's a great insight to have. These are people that you can talk to: physicians, clergy, even teachers, touching base. But most often, parents will have contact with them. But rarely are we, utilizing our clergy personnel or physicians as allies, as you say, to help us in this fight for mental health. And just gaining insight as to what's going on. A lot of times, kids struggle with talking to their parents, but they might talk to the priest, or they might talk to the physician or the school teacher, or even a crossing guard. School, I remember in school, the crossing guard was the person that we always talked to. I mean, it was always in passing. You're trying to cross the street, you're not trying to hold up traffic. But over time, over years, the crossing guard gets to know the kids, the parents, and can see, moods change and what kids are coming in with, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are all these points of contact and all these different people who are having contact with your kids that you can use to help you get a 360 on what your kids are going through. But also in your life, there are people in your life, if you're an adult with no kids, that you can use as a gauge for what's going on. Like my girlfriend the other day was like, "You got to take a nap." She, talking to me, and she recognized that I'm a much different person when I don't nap. I'm a huge napper, and sometimes I fight it because I want to go. But if I don't nap, I'm not as effective as that seems to be the through line on this episode in terms of effectiveness. So I got to nap, and if we want to show up and be mission. I forgot what you said.
Mission, like mission ready.
Preparedness. Yeah, mission ready, mission preparedness. I love that. It has a tactical military feel to it. But and it also reminds you that what you're doing is not just for yourself. If you think about it in terms of a mission, you're doing it to save not only your life and take care of your life, but the lives of the people around you. Dr. Joyner, I appreciate you taking this time for being on this episode. Please plug all your things. Where can people find you, your books? And I'm a Florida Gator fan, so I was kind of hesitant to have you on, but like I said, I'm thinking about the mission.
Well, as for the Gators, I'm a huge college football fan and huge college sports fan and huge Florida State fan. I've been here for almost 25 years. Both my boys were FSU graduates, so it's a healthy rivalry to be sure, and hopefully it'll be back on in 2021. They're not playing each other this year, already decided. Because the SEC went all SEC conference games. So that's interesting. But yeah, no, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this very much. Thanks for asking me.
This has been great. And then last question, I ask this of all my guests because I imagine that there's one person listening in who may be on the precipice of ending their life. Before you kill yourself, what would you say to them?
I would say stay. I would say stay. This is something that you might think is going to be better for everybody. It's not. It just seems that way. It just feels that way, and it can feel that way really convincingly and really deeply. That's wrong, though. It's going to be bad for everybody, horrible for everybody, agony for everybody for decades. These suicides reverberate in families across generations. It's just really, really awful for people. I do understand being that desperate, and I do understand being in that level of a crisis. And I do understand the idea of, well, that's one way out of a crisis. Okay, but there's another way. Reach out. There's resources like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 800-273-TALK. Soon, it looks like that's going to be replaced by a 3-digit hotline, 988. That's not ready yet, but that's coming. Right now, though, it's 800-273-TALK. There's resources like the crisis text line for people who would rather text than talk to somebody. We talked about clergy. We talked about family doctors. We talked about friends and family members. Just reach out and keep reaching out and just stay. Life is an incredible miracle, and it just really, really, it just really. It's worth thinking about just staying and reaching out.
Dr. Thomas Joyner, I appreciate you taking this time out. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Remember, this podcast is not a substitute for you reaching out, getting help, for you calling the 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-SUICIDE. There are all those numbers are listed not only in this episode, but they're listed in all of my episodes, and not only the local numbers, but we have international numbers. There's talk, there's text, there's group. There is someone who is willing and able to listen to you so that you feel understood, and we can get you to stay for another day. You can always go to thrivewithleo.com for one-on-one coaching with yours truly. Let's get to tomorrow together. Thank you so much, Dr. Joyner.
Thanks for having me.
As a reminder, today's episode was brought to you by Forever Me Apparel. Forever Me Apparel is all about affordable clothing that not only looks good, but feels just as good. They can and will ship anywhere in the world. They have donated over 250 pieces of clothing to people struggling, and they don't have any intentions of stopping now. They want to supply everything from head to toe. It's always been and always will be about the people, because without the people, we are just forever nothing. Head on over to forevermeapparel.com to grab a beanie, t-shirt, or bag. Once again, forevermeapparel.com.